You know what I mean? Like what I know, and I don't have to say no names or situations, but anybody in my section know that damn near like 8 out of 10 gonna be our way.
Since our last interview, Nipsey Hussle got and Eric Holder, who was basically in the same gang as Nipsey, he was a Rolling 60s Crip as well, just got convicted for and he just got 60 years. Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen Crips kill each other in your set?
Yeah, that's a sad thing. My generation, we don't Crips.
Nipsey was by the gang.
True.
And now you're hearing even his own brother saying, this was a hit by the gang. He was shot 6 times, rolling 60s. Yeah, that particular gang is known for that.
The whole idea of joining a gang back in the day is protecting each other, but with the Rollin' 60s Crips, that has not always been the case. There have been times when this gang went from protecting one another to straight each other.
Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen Crips each other in your set?
Yeah, that's a sad thing. My generation, we don't Crips.
Yeah, some of them was, and a lot of it was that they all was high, but a lot of my homeboys died at the hands of my homeboys.
This tragic trend goes way back to the 90s, but let's take it from the heartbreaking story of Nipsey Hussle, whose life was cut short by Eric Holder, a fellow member of the same gang.
Since our last interview, Nipsey Hussle got and Eric Holder, who was basically in the same gang as Nipsey, he was a Rolling 60s Crip as well, just got convicted and he just got 60 years.
Nipsey was by the gang.
True.
And now you're hearing even his own brother saying, this was a hit by the gang. He was shot 6 times, rolling 60s. Yeah, that particular gang is known for that.
Then there's Keith Thomas, an OG who was ambushed and shot in the head by one of his closest Gs. Then there was OG banker T-Well, who was in front of his own home by his own gang. It's left everyone wondering, how did the Rolling 60s end up like this? Once a rebellious force in the streets of LA, now they're known for turning against their own, completely losing sight of what they once stood for. For a little backstory, the Rolling 60s neighborhood Crips started as a clique led by Stanley Tukey Williams in the 1970s. Their territory stretches from Slauson Ave to Florence Ave between Western Ave and Crenshaw Boulevard. They're part of the Rolling O's and Neighborhood Crips umbrella and have earned a reputation as one of the most infamous and fierce black gangs in L.A. Hyde Park, Crenshaw area. They're easily recognized by their Seattle Mariners baseball caps, the S symbolizing 60. The gang's made up of several cliques like the Avenues, Front Hood, Overhills, and a few others. A lot of the younger members go to Crenshaw High or Westchester High. Cops estimate their membership to be between 6,000 and 8,000, making them the largest black gang in all of LA County. But the seeds of all this inner conflict were planted the moment Keith Stone Thomas was So let's dig into how it all started. At 30, Keith Thomas was one of the most respected leaders of the Rollin' 60s, a gang that had earned a reputation for striking fear into the streets of Los Angeles with their wild and fearless ways. But Keith, better known as Stone around Crenshaw Boulevard, wasn't like the younger guys coming up in the gang. Those kids were all about quick money, flashy jewelry, and chasing a dangerous kind of fame. Stone was old school. He represented the Crips of the 1970s when it was about community, loyalty, and standing strong for the neighborhood. Back then, being down for the hood wasn't about tearing it apart but protecting it. Even though Stone was knee-deep in the gang's violent hustle in the crack coke trade, he lived by a code. He saw how greed and backstabbing were eating away at the unity they once had, and he wasn't afraid to speak up about it.
But from Keith Stone, I learned how to be a hustler and a father and a man and a leader all of that.
He was well loved.
And he was always telling me, man, now you got to get out that game.
In his later years, Stone started pushing for peace. He even reached out to rival gangs and started wearing wooden African beads, drawing inspiration from leaders like Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan. Some of the younger Rollin' 60s listened to him, if only out of respect. But his warnings about the growing chaos in the gang didn't stop what came next. Stone's death shook everyone to their core. The same violence he had warned about ended up taking him out in the most brutal way. As one longtime member of the Rollin' 60s put it, "We started out as brothers loving brothers. Now the neighborhood don't really trust each other no more. There used to be respect. Now it's like everybody's against everybody." According to authorities, Stone's looked like the result of a drug deal gone bad. His body was found face down in an avocado grove in Duarte. along with his friend Daniel Chapman, who'd been handcuffed and shot in the head just like him. The story behind it is even darker. Keith had driven up to Duarte in a rented Ford Explorer, bringing Danny along for the ride. They were going to meet Anthony, a Duarte Crip and someone Keith trusted. Anthony had been a regular at Keith's home in Windsor Hills, and they'd been in the consignment game together for years. This time, Keith was supposedly there to collect his cut from a deal, but the moment Keith parked outside Anthony's house, things went sideways. Anthony had already decided to betray him, blowing through the money and choosing to rob Keith instead of paying up. Keith and Danny were ambushed, forced to lie face down at gunpoint, handcuffed, and blindfolded. The SUV was completely ransacked. Sources say Keith pleaded with them, saying, "You ain't gotta do us like this, cuz." But it didn't matter. Letting Keith go wasn't an option. They'd gone too far. The two were forced into the back of the SUV, covered with a shower curtain and tablecloth, and driven miles away to the Avocado Grove. There, both men were executed with single gunshots to the head. The killers ditched the truck and took off in another car, leaving their bodies behind. When word got out that Stone had been it sent shockwaves through the streets. Even those who lived by the dog-eat-dog mentality couldn't believe it. Stone wasn't supposed to die like this. Not betrayed, not ambushed. In the end, 4 Duarte Crips were convicted for the murder. But Stone's death marked a turning point for the Rollin' 60s, too, a grim reminder of how far they had fallen from the unity they once claimed to stand for. Then there was OG banger T. Well, another Rolling 60s legend who had love and respect from everyone across the 60s hood. He wasn't just a gang member, he was a hustler, a player, and one of the biggest moneymakers to ever come out of the crew. The 60s have always been known for being a get-money hood, and Banger T stood out even in a crowd of bank robbers, flockers, and big-time drug dealers, both during the height of the crack era and long after. Banger T was famous for his signature Jerry curls, his fresh style, and his flashy lifestyle. He had it all: money, women, and cars. But it wasn't just about the material stuff. People were drawn to his charisma, his character, and the way he carried himself like a natural leader. He was the type of guy who looked out for his people, especially the younger homies. Whether it was offering advice, support, or straight up cash when they needed it, he always made sure his presence was felt in the best way. Even today, Banger T's influence runs deep in the 60s. Many say he coined some of the slang and culture that the hood still uses. His legacy is still alive and well, and he's remembered as one of the freshest, most impactful Crips of his generation. But 1994 brought tragedy to the 60s when Banger T's life was cut short in a way that rocked the community. The story goes that he was in the Avenue section of the hood when he got into an argument with his girlfriend. Not long after, a car pulled up, and he was shot and right there in the Avenue's territory. Rumors spread like wildfire, with many saying it was an internal beef. A fellow Rolling 60s member allegedly killed Banger T over a woman. Losing him was a massive blow to the 60s. He was more than just a member. He was part of the foundation, someone who held the hood together with his presence and leadership. Even though it's been over 30 years since his death, Banger T is still talked about and honored. His name comes up in songs by younger Rolling 60s rappers like Pac-Man the Gunman and Conrad from the Ave, keeping his memory alive for a new generation. Banger T wasn't just a figure of the past. He's still a symbol of what the 60s once stood for. Then there's Fred Hill, who almost died in the hands of his fellow gang members. Fred was also known as Big Snoop Dogg, not the Long Beach rapper but the OG from the Rolling 60s, who was born around 1958. He spent his early years on the east side of South Central before moving to 6th Avenue, right in Rolling 60s territory, around 1967. By 1975, when he was just 17, Fred had already earned a reputation as a serious and feared figure in the neighborhood. Some even credit him with coming up with the name Rolling 60s. Over the 70s and 80s, Fred solidified himself as one of the gang's most infamous members, with the Rolling 60s battling rival groups like the Bloods, the Hoovers, and other Crip sets, gaining a reputation as one of L.A.'s deadliest gangs. Fred's life was a mix of street loyalty and fleeting attempts to step away. After doing time for attempted He returned to the streets, but also spent part of the 90s working as a gang counselor. Despite this, Fred stayed active in the rolling 60s, earning both respect and fear for his no-nonsense, aggressive demeanor. Even as he got older, he stayed involved, and by the 2000s, Fred, now in his 40s, was named as a leader in a gang injunction targeting the rolling 60s. Things took a dramatic turn in 2005, after a fellow rolling 60s member was Fred, now holding Super OG status, called a meeting at an apartment complex known as a gang hangout. He instructed everyone to wear white t-shirts as a show of unity, but one member, Little CJ, showed up in a black shirt. Fred publicly called him out, embarrassing him in front of everyone. CJ left but came back with a gun, firing twice and hitting Fred in the wrist and head. Despite being injured, Fred survived and initially identified Little CJ as the shooter to the police. Days later, Fred worked with detectives, even pointing CJ out in a lineup and describing where he lived. But as the case moved forward, things changed. Both Fred and another witness, Nicolia, backed out of testifying. Fred went so far as to claim he didn't know CJ, never spoke to the police, and had no memory of the incident at all. Despite their recantations, Little CJ was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life. He's been in prison since 2007 with his earliest parole date in 2031. Fred's story is one of contradictions, a life torn between the streets, survival, and fleeting attempts to step away, with a dramatic series of events that forever impacted those around him. Then there's Sandman Negus, who some would call the Nipsey Hussle before Nipsey Hussle became a household name.
Shut off the block, rappers a lot. Drive-by Thunderdomes and from crash cops.
Born on January 12, 1986 in Bulgaria, Sandman's life started in chaos. His family, originally from Eritrea, was caught in the middle of the Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict. Because of the war and a corrupt government, they couldn't even get his birth certificate. Not long after his birth, the family had to leave Bulgaria and move to Sudan in 1993. By the time Sandman was 7, his family had relocated again, this time to the United States, hoping for a fresh start. They settled in Los Angeles, and Sandman started school at Hyde Park Elementary, right in the middle of rolling 60s territory. By the late 90s, Sandman was already getting involved in the street life that surrounded him. One incident in his neighborhood showed just how intense things could get. Sandman, just a kid at the time, was riding his bike and keeping watch on the block after a gang-related shooting the night before. He spotted someone parked in a red car, a color that didn't sit right with the locals, and immediately alerted others. Moments later, 2 cars full of rolling 60s members surrounded the car, guns drawn, ready to handle the situation. Luckily, the driver managed to talk his way out of it, but it was a tense reminder of how quickly things could escalate. Tragedy struck Sandman's family in 1997 when his older brother, someone he deeply admired, was killed in gang violence. The loss hit hard, and something in Sandman changed. He started channeling his emotions into art, rapping, writing, and sketching. Inspired by legends like Tupac and Nas, he began pouring his energy into music while also juggling a strict upbringing. His father ran a tight ship at home, which made Sandman even more rebellious during his teenage years. He also worked at his family's gas station, located on Florence and Crenshaw, while pursuing his music dreams. In 2005, Sandman caught a break when he was recruited by Yahoo and Pepsi for a West Coast talent segment called Mike Pass. Around the same time, he was being managed by Big U, who believed in his potential and signed him to Unique Music Entertainment.
Sandman the Goose, coming at you. Got next. No, you got now. Watch it. Here we come.
This was before Big U started working closely with Nipsey Hussle.
We getting it in out here. The boy Sandman the Goose, man. You know it's a collaboration. We all get money, my
100.
Sandman and Nipsey actually knew each other from childhood since their families were close.
Yeah, this the boy right here. You already know we get it in, though.
Ground zero.
So groundwork, baby.
You already know what it is.
We coming from the
Yes,
bottom
sir.
up.
Day one home team.
The boy Nip Hussle. We getting it in out here.
But Sandman's life took a darker turn. At 19, he spent months in jail for a robbery he didn't commit, though he was later cleared. By 20, he found himself locked up again after getting caught up in the streets. It wasn't until he survived being shot 9 times in 2008 that he started to truly reevaluate his life. On that night, after leaving the studio, he was followed by gang members who shot him repeatedly. Sandman's injuries were severe. His colon, liver, lungs, diaphragm, shoulders, and neck were all hit. He endured 8 surgeries and spent 26 days in a coma, but somehow survived. After recovering, Sandman threw himself back into his music, using it as therapy. He spent countless hours in the studio, determined to make something of himself, but the streets were never far behind. On September 27, 2012, while in an alley near Big U's studio, Sandman was fatally shot. It was a tragic end to a life filled with promise, resilience, and a relentless drive to rise above his circumstances. His legacy, much like Nipsey's, is a testament to the struggle and strength of those who fight to make it out of a tough environment. After Sandman's death, rumors swirled all over LA, sparking endless debates about who was responsible and why. Some whispered that the BPS, Schoolyard Crips, or even his own Rolling 60s set might have had a hand in it. People couldn't ignore how suspicious the circumstances felt. Court records revealed that earlier on the day of his murder, a fight broke out between Fortray gangster Crips and 40 members at a McDonald's on Crenshaw. One of the Fortray members involved was a man named Oliver. After being punched during the altercation, Oliver and his crew went back to their hood to regroup. An hour later, they returned to the area, this time in an alley near the McDonald's, where Oliver allegedly fired a gun over the roof of a car, fatally striking Sandman. 6 days after the shooting, Oliver sent a text that raised eyebrows. In the message, he mentioned how someone close to Sandman told him he needed to leave LA. He also admitted he'd meet with her but would only talk about the fight, not the shooting. Not long after, Oliver changed his phone number. Eventually, police detained him, and he was found guilty of first-degree receiving a 50-year to life sentence. But even with that conviction, Sandman's family wasn't satisfied. They didn't buy the story. They believed there was more to the case and doubted Sandman had anything to do with the fight at McDonald's, let alone being there when Oliver was punched. It didn't add up. The streets echoed the family's suspicions, with whispers suggesting that maybe the Rolling 60s themselves had played a role in his death. As the years went on, comparisons between Sandman and Nipsey Hussle became unavoidable. Both were local legends in their own right, and both stories were marred by tragedy. But there was a glaring difference. Sandman's legacy wasn't embraced in the same way. Many noticed how Nipsey or the 60s didn't publicly honor Sandman's memory, which fueled speculation about unresolved issues or lingering tensions. It was even rumored that, at the time of Sandman's death, he and Nipsey weren't on the best terms. Fast forward to 2019, and tragedy struck the Rolling 60s again, this time on a global scale. Nipsey Hussle, the rapper and community leader who had grown into an international icon, was gunned down outside his Marathon clothing store in South LA. The shooter, Eric Holder, was also a member of the Rolling 60s. Holder's anger boiled over after Nipsey allegedly called him a snitch, prompting him to leave, arm himself, and return minutes later to commit the act. A jury found Holder guilty of first-degree
consecutive. That would be an additional 25 years to life. So for count one alone, it would be 50 years to life. The total sentence would be 60 years to life in prison.
But Nipsey's death left a massive void in the culture and the streets alike. For many, the parallels between Sandman and Nipsey are haunting. Two men who had the potential to change their world, yet couldn't escape the tangled web of street politics and betrayal. While Nipsey's legacy continues to inspire, Sandman's story remains a stark reminder of how easily greatness can be snuffed out in a world that's always at war with itself. The streets may forget some names, but they never forget the lessons.